So this is a pond that I put in for one of my clients, and there's a couple of nice little waterfalls. And at the far end of it, the shallow end, it has gotten kind of a little thick with algae. There's this stuff that's on the surface, and there's also some deeper stuff. So this end is essentially stagnant, and what we're going to do is take that, get out of the reflection of the sun here, we're going to take that fountain and we're going to put it in here to bring some circulation from the deep end into the shallow end to flow the other way to help clear this end of the pond up and make it look a little bit nicer. Alright, picked up a cool fish fountain at a yard sale for next to nothing, but the base of it is pretty much flush with the bottom, so if you hook the hose up, you know, it's gonna get that at an angle where you can see what's happening with that. You're gonna pinch the hose off, and you're gonna fold the hose flat if you set it right in the rocks in the pond or whatever, or you know, in your pond. So I'm gonna make a base and to kind of hold it up a little bit. And what I've decided to use is these tomato little tomato things. You put these around the base of a tomato and water it, and it keeps the soil warm and keeps the soil moist around the tomato. These are great for tomatoes. I didn't grow any tomatoes this year, so I've got these left over, and it just so happens that they fit right up in there pretty good. So by pouring a slab in here, that will leave me an opening big enough to put the hose down in, and then I'll attach that slab to a lower slab with a piece of PVC for the hose to go to exit out of. And what I'm going to use for this is mortar mix. I'm not going to try and pick that up. So mortar mix, and this is basically Portland cement with sand in it. But this, you know, you buy a bag of mortar mix, it's real inexpensive, and it makes doesn't have any rocks in it, so it's easy to work with. As I've mentioned in the hypertufa videos, I'm not going to be using hypertufa for this application because this will be underwater, so how it looks doesn't matter. But whenever you're working with concrete, you want to wear gloves, some kind of protective gloves, because concrete is caustic, and you also want to wear a good, decent quality particle mask. The ones they use for sanding wallboard or a plaster, that sort of thing, are ideal, because breathing the dust from concrete when it's dry is really bad for your lungs. So I've measured out an appropriate amount of mortar mix, and let's see, where's my water container? And just like mixing hypertufa or cement, you want to add water a little bit at a time and mix it, because it's real easy to add too much. Getting the right thickness of the mortar mix or concrete or hypertufa all is a real sensitive thing. You go from being just a little bit too dry to way too wet in about a heartbeat, about a half a cup of water in a big batch. So kind of want to add it a little bit at a time. Make sure you don't put too much in. Now this particular project is going to be a multiple part project. I'm going to pour the top half today, and then I'll pour the bottom half in about 2 or 3 days. You want to give the mortar a few days to set up and harden before you add the next, before you take it out of the mold, basically. So I've had plenty of time to firm up. There, looks like we got it pretty close right there. There's a little bit of powder still on the bottom, but the consistency is looking real good. So that's what you want. You don't want it to be dry, but you don't want it to drip off your trowel either. You want it to just be kind of plastic, almost like modeling clay. That's the ideal moisture content. And then once it's all mixed up, you just put it in your mold, and you can buy molds, fancy molds for stepping stones, and if you're going to do that, mortar mix is a real good option for putting in those. This might not be quite enough. I'm going to mix up a little bit more, but because concrete mix has a rock in it, a lot of rock, and it's kind of filler. But when you're working with a small mold or on a small project, using the mortar mixes, that way you can, if you want to add something decorative like rock or marbles or whatever, you can always add it, but you don't have all that rock that you have to work around in the mold to get it seated just right, so you don't have big air bubbles. Looks like I mixed that up just about right. Just about the exact right amount. So when you put the concrete in the mold, or whenever you're forming concrete, you want to kind of shake it down. Kind of work it down. Even things out. When you pat it, or whether you're using your hand or you're using a tool, you'll notice that it kind of wiggles like Jello, and that's pretty much the perfect consistency. And then once you've got it all the right height, just smooth it off. And this part doesn't have to be real perfect on this particular one. Now, because I need it to fit, I need this mold, or this, let's see if I can take that off. I'm going to pause this for a second. Alright, I got the hose off, and I'm just going to set this on the on this mortar mix real quick. I'm going to make an impression. So when it's all done, it'll have a kind of a seat to sit in. The way to go. Let's try that again. Now I could leave it like that, but then it would adhere to the fountain, and I want to be able to take the fountain off the base. So what I think I'm going to do to facilitate that process, see, I got a nice little indentation there. So I'm going to put a piece of plastic, in this case it's bubble wrap, and I'll just set that right there. And I'll leave it like that for about 24 hours to just to dry, and then I'll lift the fountain off, and in a couple of days I'll take the mold off, and I'll form the underside of the base with the piece of PVC in it to fit the pipe through. Alright, it's been about 3 days since the last take that I did. I've removed the fountain, and as you can see there's a nice seat in it now for the fountain to sit in. You just rest in there and it's very stable, so that worked well. Now we're going to remove the concrete from the form. Hopefully this will go smoothly. I did not use a releasing agent because plastic is flexible enough. It usually comes off pretty easy. Okay. Whoops. Looks like I'm going to lose a little bit of my form to breakage, but oh well. These are cheap and I haven't used them for a while. There. So now, the advantage of having these knobs here is this will give something for the concrete that will go underneath here, something to adhere to so that it won't separate. And as you can see, it's pretty porous. I did not do anything to try and get the bubbles out. So that will also make for a better surface for this to work on. Alright, I got to figure out how I'm going to do this, because the pipe obviously has to come out from underneath, and yeah, I've got to figure this out. Alright, here's the solution I've come up with. I cut the top off of a pot like I used for making pavers that was the right size to fit over this, and because the edges hung over a little bit, I had to put some tape in to keep the concrete from leaking out. And then I took the bubble wrap and I put it inside of a plastic bag and put it down here so that when everything's dry and hard I can just pull it out, and then we can just press the piece of pipe into it. So I'm going to mix up some mortar mix and we'll get on with this. Okay, got some mortar mix put in the container to mix up. Got my mask on. Always use a mask when you're working with wet concrete or with dry concrete, and when you're working with wet concrete, if you're going to be touching it at all, which I will be, you'll want to have some gloves to wear. These are my heavy duty ones, but I left the lighter weight ones, which would have been fine inside, so I'll just use these. I mentioned earlier, you want to add water a little bit at a time, because it's real easy to add too much and then you have soup that doesn't turn out well. By getting it just the right moisture level, you assure a good uniform mix of sand and cement, or whatever other aggregate you're using. If it gets too wet, the aggregate tends to settle out, and cement will tend to float to the surface, and that gives you an uneven, less than ideal mix. Okay, that seems to be pretty uniformly mixed. May need to mix up a little bit more. This doesn't look like it's going to fill it. Maybe we'll be okay. Yeah, I think we're going to be okay. So this time I'm going to work the concrete a little bit more thoroughly. Try and reduce the number of bubbles that are going to be in here, in this bottom part. Yeah, I may need to mix up a little bit more. And I want to really work this what do they call this? Mason mix into the bubbles and whatnot in the little posts that I have in there, so that we get a really good adhesion, and so that, you know, this doesn't come apart. And the way you do that is you just kind of work the concrete really thoroughly with the tip of your trowel or spoon or whatever you happen to be using. Yeah, I need to mix up just a little bit more. Maybe a couple of cups. Yeah, definitely gonna have to mix up some more. A little better. Yeah, so I cut this form so there'd be about 3/4 of an inch of cement above the top of the plastic bag, so that I'd have good solid support. And again, working it like this deep into the cement mix allows you to get really good, removes most of the bubbles and produce a smoother surface, and in this case will allow the mix that I've just put in to adhere really well to the dry previous part. For this kind, if you're joining two pieces, it's usually a good idea to put some screws or some nails into the piece that's drying first, that stick out a little bit. That also gives a great way to, or pieces of wire that are bent. You don't want something that's straight, but something that's jagged or bent or has a head or whatever, to for the new wet concrete to grab a hold of. that's pretty flat, pretty smooth. I'm going to come back in a little bit, and when it's starting to thicken up a bit and dry a little bit, and smooth that off and make sure it's really flat. So here we have the finished product. I took the mold off the other day, and these edges were a little rough, so I don't know if you can see the seam or not, but I added some additional cement around just to kind of smooth this up to make it look neat. And as you can see, there's the access port for the hose, and I've got a good hole here. And oops, get that in the right spot. Well, there's a point here somewhere. Ah, there it is. No, that's not it either. There. Is it? Okay. Anyway, it sits in its little spot. It's pretty stable. There we go. Doesn't want to twist or turn. It doesn't want to tip over, so it's nice and stable. So that's the finished project, and then I'll put this in a pond. I'll put the hose through here and hook it up to the pump. And we selected the spot. We're going to put it right here, and to protect the liner from getting possibly poked by the concrete base, we're going to put down some all-purpose sand, and then we're going to take a little piece of leftover pond liner and put that on top of the sand, and that will both level the surface that the fountain will sit on and protect the liner underneath from any possibility of a puncture. So I already cleared the loose rocks out of the way. Part. Cool. Alright, anyway, I'm going to lay the hose out and get the pump hooked up. Turn it back on in a minute. So here's the finished product. Let me back up a little bit. I've got it splashing against the side of the rock here to minimize splashing out of the pond, and so there won't be a lot of water splashing out of the pond. So yeah, nice addition to this really beautiful pond. There's the upper waterfall. Upper pool, lower waterfall, lower pool, and in the shallow end now there's a fish fountain. So there it is, all finished.